This is a topic that was proposed or assigned to me, and I'll admit that I'm not super fluent in this field, but it is a field that I am very much interested in. I remember when I was doing my engineering studies, two of my favorite subjects, it just so happened to be, were the two subjects that any engineer needs the least of, and it was philosophy and psychology. So I do really enjoy learning about these things, and having my wife being in the field also is a huge advantage to me. So I can always bounce ideas off of her, and she helps me out a lot in figuring these things and clarifying how they fit together. So social and emotional connectedness, the need for community right now. So let's set it up first of all, and kind of course, state the obvious before we start to get into the nitty gritty of it. We are in a phase of social distancing right now, which is obvious. And so some of the implications of that means that there is limited interaction. It's not like how it was before. You don't get to go to school and smell the food that's cooking in the cafeteria. You don't get to see people talking to each other, joking, laughing. You don't get to hug people. You don't get to shake hands with people. In a lot of different ways, we are, of course, obviously limited in our interaction. This also provides us with a lot more free time for ourselves. For those who are living at home with your parents, or there's probably only two people, or maybe a few who are in the family bracket where you may be having kids, then time actually is not so abundant, but still I think you get more time now to yourself. And so what are the challenges? Well, for both of them, there are advantages and disadvantages. In one way, it might be good that there's a lot of limited interactions. For example, my wife, who works in the field of addiction, said that a lot of people are unable to go to bars these days. So in some ways, it's kind of restricting people's bad influences that they get, because they're not able to interact with the same crowd that they're used to interacting with. But of course, on the other side, we don't have that support group that we used to have. Having more time to oneself is definitely, I think, a positive thing. But for some people, it can be a very anxiety-filled kind of time, because a lot of times I think we live in a society that constantly bombards us with noise so that we can avoid spending time with ourselves. And we don't like to know what's going on in our head. We would rather distract ourselves with Netflix or Spotify or whatever it may be. But this is one of the, I think, advantages and disadvantages of having time with yourself. And so we're in this situation. How do we handle it? And what's the biblical perspective of it all? So I think that this is a very important subject, because social and emotional connectedness, or the idea of community, is so intricately woven into just this fundamental being of what does it mean to be human? How can I be fully human? When you read Genesis, chapter 1, after everything God makes, it's good. And by the time you get to Genesis 2, the only time that, or the first time that God says it's not good, is after he's created Adam and sees that Adam is alone. And it's interesting that he points this out as the moment of not good. I always wondered, why does he say that Adam is alone? Adam isn't alone. God is there. Wouldn't God be enough for him? There's a lot of that kind of ideology going around these days too, which kind of says that, I don't need the church. I just need God. But it seems that when God is saying it's not good for Adam to be alone, or for man to be alone, one thing he's not saying is it's not that he's saying it's a bad idea for God and human to be by themselves with each other. That's a good thing. There's nothing wrong with that. The bad part of it is that there's no one on Adam's level. He doesn't have a peer. He doesn't have a companion. And the Hebrew word for it is suitable helper. which kind of rubs people the wrong way. So let me just kind of say that in the Old Testament, there are several times when God is considered a helper for Israel. So in no way should we think of a suitable helper as being somehow subservient to the other. They are, in fact, equal. And if you want to go to another extent, it's almost as if you need the other person's assistance, without which you cannot function. And so Adam needed someone else. And I think this is part of the whole idea now of what actually then is God's plan, right? And it's not it doesn't have anything to do with just be happy with your bed and your mama. It's much more than that. It's being able to connect with all the people around you, and to be able to understand that you are equal with others, right? So that's I think a big part of it is this whole idea of community is this place where we feel a part of, we feel like we belong to it. We have a sense of intimacy, deep intimacy with one another in only when we're at this level of peer. Now, of course, within this concept of intimacy is sexual intimacy, which of course is kind of set apart for us within the healthy framework and boundaries of a loving marriage. But intimacy can be had even outside of that. The broader term of being intimate with someone just means to be really close, to be able to know someone and to be known by that person. That's what I think we mean when we talk about intimacy. God's plan is that we would be intimate with one another, that we would have a connection or a fellowship with one another. And this is why I think it's really bad when people say that, well, I want God, but not the church. It's in a very, like, I couldn't think of a nice example that wasn't just crass, but you can't you can't objectify God like that and just want one side of him, because the church is the body of Christ. And so we do need, we really need, and part of God's plan is that we have a wider community, this wider fellowship. Now, of course, there are times when being away from this body or from this fellowship, it becomes more of a reality for us. Now, sometimes it's because of external causes, like the current situation that we're in now is because of external causes. We can't really affect that. Um, Other times it's internal causes. Maybe I choose not to attend church, right? So sometimes our distance from the body or our nearness to the body of Christ is deeply affected by external and internal causes. And it's important for us to understand to what degree do I have influence over the external and the internal causes that separate me from or hinder me or keep me away from this fellowship, right? So for example, we cannot change the shelter in place policy. It needs to be there, and it makes sense that it's there. But of course, there are ways that we can find alternative means of communication with one another. Another example is we can't change the neurochemistry in our brain. It is what it is. But we can choose positive thoughts, positive behaviors, and positive actions, and that can make a big impact on the situation that we're in. Right? So each person has their own unique personality, and some people are very outgoing, and some people are a little bit more shy and reserved. I am actually more in the introvert side of things. I'm very comfortable with a book and being by myself. But no one is able to say that they do not need anyone. I'm sure, I don't know now, because when we make movie references, it sometimes clicks really well with everybody, and sometimes no one knows what movie you're talking about because you're too old. But I think everyone's seen the movie Castaway by Tom Hanks, with Tom Hanks, and You see that in that movie when he's on the island by himself, he creates Wilson. And so everyone needs a Wilson in their lives, and hopefully it's a real person and not some sort of a concoction of our imagination. And so as Christians, theologically, we are set apart, but we're not set apart from others, right? We are meant to be in relationship, in companionship with one another. So going back to Adam, we notice that Adam didn't get to decide. No one asked him for his input. Hey, are you comfortable by yourself? God saw the situation and God understood that there is a lacking here. And God makes the affirmation that it's not good for him to be by himself. So this is something that we need to understand, that um, though we like to assert our strong independence and our self-reliance, there is no level of self-reliance that can survive without the need for others. And so God has established this truth that it is not good for humanity to be alone. And so this is kind of where we find ourselves. So what is connectedness then, right? So what is God trying to do here? What is the kind of community and the kind of relationship that God is trying to establish here? I think it's one of equality. It's not one of a relationship between a inferior and a superior. It's definitely, it's good to have friends who are older than you, and it's good to have friends who are younger than you. But in the end, you need to have friends who you consider equal to you, and that's regardless of age, right? We should not confuse this with identical, right? The idea is not that in order to satisfy the need for fellowship that we find identical people to us. That's not what the Bible does. Otherwise, God could have created a second Adam and made the mechanics work so that that would have been enough. But he made something complementary in nature. And so we have to understand that there is an equality that does not necessarily mean the same as being identical. Yes, we naturally gravitate to similar people as us, and that's not wrong, but it can have its pitfalls. I've noticed this for some time now, and I've done nothing to correct it either, that my Facebook feed is highly curated. When I see, I do it less now, but the damage has been done. When I see a post that annoys me, I unfollow that person until it gets to a point where everyone in my feed looks just like me, thinks just like me. Right? So that's a big danger, because I don't think that's not real connectedness at that point. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit. Um, these days, it's kind of very interesting because the phase of life that I'm in now, I feel most closest with my mom when I talk to her as my equal. And we both talk about parenting and the different challenges that we face. And she doesn't try to advise me, and I don't have to bite my tongue. And for a moment or two, we can talk to each other as equals. Now, of course, that's not always the case, and it's neither possible nor appropriate to always have that equal kind of relationship with my mom. But definitely, I can admit that I feel closer to her when there is more of that equality aspect that shines through. So I think that when we're talking about connectedness, it's not just about how many people, or um, it really talks about the quality of the connections between the people that we interact with, and how well we'll talk about this, how well we accept them. Right, so this is right, tied in with the idea of connectedness is this idea of acceptance. Right? Why do we long for connectedness? Why do we want to be socially and emotionally connected with other people? I think that part of it is curiosity, part of it is loneliness, but I think a much deeper part of it is this desire, this basic desire to be accepted, right? We all want to feel like we belong to something bigger than us, that we're a part of something. And whether we like to admit it or not, we derive our identity from a mixture of our social relationships and our self-identification. Who we connect with says a lot about who we think we are. And we hope that these people would accept us at a very basic fundamental level. Now, this is interesting. And this whole idea of our identity coming from our individuality and from our social connectedness. And so this is this kind of, I don't think there's a real debate going on between these two fields, but they know they complement each other, sociology and psychology, right? So the study of collective people versus the study of individual people, right? So when we approach this topic of social connectedness or emotional connectedness, there is a whole side of this that is much more psychological in nature, where we need to talk a lot about our own self-evaluation. How comfortable am I with myself? Because that all makes a big impact on how we relate to others. But for the purpose of this talk, we're going to limit it more to the other side, which is how do I connect with others, right? So there needs to be a balance between myself and my society, right? Then anytime you tilt to one extreme or the other, whether it's a tilt towards the side of individualism, which you find in America, or a tilt to the side of communalism, which you find in Asian countries like India, they have their advantages, but they also come with their whole set of disadvantages. I'm not going to say which one is right and which one is wrong. I'm just going to say that we all need to strive to find a healthy balance between affirming ourselves and our own independence, along with our need and reliance on the community around us, right? Both of them have to be held together. So connectedness, let's kind of build up to this concept of acceptance, right? So connectedness, I think, starts at a fundamental, at a very basic level with being acknowledged. Do I belong? And I remember when I was a youth, I would ask this question, would everyone even notice if I wasn't here, right? If I didn't show up to church on Sunday, would anyone notice? And so now when I look back at it, that's a very deep question, like, or it's a very deep challenge to how connected or how little I felt connected to the community that I was a part of. And so I think the very basic thing is to know that people acknowledge me, that I actually do feel a part of this community. But that in and of itself does not constitute connectedness, right? That's not enough. To feel acknowledged is not enough. I think the next step is to maybe feel validated. But to feel validated still isn't enough. For example, if my child has a learning disability, I can understand that. I can now alter my behavior towards it, but I might still, in some part of my broken humanity, be annoyed and not accepting of it, and wanting him to be something other than he or she is. Right? So validating is, at least it goes beyond acknowledging. You are at least a little more understanding, but it doesn't still mean fully acceptance. So I think the next and the biggest step is to finally and to deeply be received for who you are in your current imperfect state. Now, this doesn't mean that when you accept someone that you agree with everything that they're doing or that you are okay with where they're at, but it means that you receive them from where they currently are. and you aren't trying to make them different than what they, or you aren't loving just a future version of them. You are comfortable and content and accepting of the current and present person that is there in front of you. Now, this was really hard for me to explain without using Bible terminology. Right? But I didn't want to use the biblical language because I think we hear it so often that we kind of forget what it means. Right? So I kind of put it in these terms for now. Um, Now, when it comes to if the basic desire is acceptance, and if my need and desire to be socially and emotionally connected to others is so that I can satisfy this desire to be accepted, we kind of have to ask ourselves this question, which comes first? Should the group accept me or should I accept them? Right? And I had this, I remember this debate came up so many times in our youth fellowship days back in Houston. Um, they don't come and talk to me, therefore I feel like this fellowship is not very meaningful. And people in the other side would say, well, that individual stays by themselves and that individual doesn't come to us. And both sides were expecting the other side to accept them first before they would accept them, right? So there's this whole idea of which really comes first. Um, I think that we have to first critically examine who are we accepting of? Because it's hard enough to find people who accept us. It'll be much harder to find people who accept us if we are not first trying to be accepting of others. And so if we're going to try and be accepting of others, let's critically evaluate who in my group am I currently being accepting of? Um, do they all happen to look like me? Do they all happen to think like me? To what extent do we choose to accept people who are easy to accept? And there's a flip side to this too. There's some people who struggle with accepting certain sides of themselves. And so they will not accept those 10 types of individuals that they meet. For example, if a person is struggling with a porn addiction, they will stay away from being friends with someone who says all the crass jokes just because they don't like that part of themselves, and so they don't want to be close to that person who acts that way. But still, the idea then is that we're only doing what is based on our own interests. Right? So when we talk about acceptance, acceptance is not talking about what's in our best interest. Acceptance means what's in their best interest. And this is why I think it's important for everyone to have a few good friends who are seniors and to have a few good friends who are younger to you. It doesn't happen very much in our culture, in our diaspora culture, specifically here in America, I've noticed. It seems very different. I remember when I was in Chennai, youth would be almost buddy-buddy with the people in the uncle and auntie age bracket. That I think is partly because there was a very little cultural gap between them, and so they could. But I remember looking at that and really um, being jealous of it because I didn't have it like that. And I think we all lack something when we're unable to accept others as they are. If our level of acceptance of others is only based on ourselves, then the kind of community you will be left with is the kind of community that you find at like a sporting game, where the fans are a community as long as they're all cheering for the same team. But it's not very deep. And what would happen, God forbid, if you choose to cheer for the other team? Well, you would realize that suddenly the community that you thought was so tight knit is not very tight knit. And so this is one of the big pitfalls with not evaluating critically our own level of acceptance of others. Because if we're only accepting people like us, that means that it's very difficult for us to grow and change. Because the moment we grow and change, we're not going to be like this group anymore. Either we won't like them anymore or they won't like us anymore. And we're left back with this basic problem of not feeling accepted again. Right? So I think in order to get closer to satisfying the desire to be accepted, you have to first learn to accept others. And now to put the whole biblical spin on this, right? Which came first, definitively, the chicken or the egg? So to put the debate to rest, right? God first loved us. Right? God first made the initiative to say, I accept you, sin and all. Right? It doesn't mean that he's happy with the way we're living our lives. He certainly wants what's best for us, but he doesn't love us based on a future version of ourselves either. He loves us as we currently are. And so it's that kind of level of acceptance that really stirs up a genuine response of love back. Whenever you don't have that level of acceptance, you only have obligation coming back, but not necessarily love coming back. And so it's very important that we understand that God very paradoxically set this system up that says that if you want to feel accepted, first accept others, just like I did with you, right? And God went out on a limb and accepted us before we accepted him. But he knew the power of acceptance. So let's use the biblical language. He knew the power of love, of unconditional love. And he knew that if he does it this way, that it actually and only has the power to change us. Next slide. So let's kind of bring it home here. What is the fruit of social and emotional connectedness? Now, I admit there's a whole bunch of stuff that we did not cover. I was telling Roshan, just the word social would be a semester, right? You can't do all of it in 20, 30 minutes, but hopefully this much helps to set up now the fruit of it. So the fruit of social and emotional connectedness, I think, are several. One is that there is a strength, a real strength, a safety net that is found in fellowship. Ecclesiastes chapter 4 has this very beautiful and very often quoted line at times of marriage, right? Two are better than one, for there is a reward for their toil. And no one references the verse that comes just a little after that, which is a cord of three is not easily broken. So it's about fellowship, right? It's about the community. When it comes together, there's strength in numbers. A family friend of ours, through Roshan primarily, they're atheist, and they have admitted to us in the past that they really struggle with this not having a deep friendship network, because when they go through difficulties, they don't have anyone. I mean, so they keep calling us, which is fine with us. We're happy. But then we were thinking about it, and we were like, we are so lucky because we have the church community. We have more than the church community. We have even beyond the church community. There's so many people who we've connected with on a very deep and intimate level, to where I know that if I go through any kind of struggle, that there's going to be people to help us, to back us up. There was a time when a member in our parish passed away, and he was the only one who had membership in our church. The rest of the family didn't. But that didn't matter. When the time of the funeral came, making all the arrangements, doing everything, families across denominational lines came together. So there was something very comforting and encouraging and strengthening in the fact that you had that fellowship. Another big fruit of social and emotional connectedness comes from the idea that when we do this, we're actually engaging in the work of God. Now, there's even Jesus needed friendship and fellowship. So he had the 12, but then within the 12, he had the three, right? Peter, James, and John were his really close friends, and he relied on them. Interestingly, right? He brought them to the Garden of Gethsemane and he said, pray with me. And he was so upset, and he came back and he saw that they were sleeping, and he's like almost begging them, pray with me. And so it's not just the humanity of Jesus that relies on the connectedness of these friends. I think very strongly so that it's also the divinity of Jesus that relies on these three. Now, we usually don't like to think of it that way, but no, we need to start thinking about it this way. God, from the very beginning, entrusts humanity to do work, right? He relies on us and he appoints us as agents. From Genesis chapter 2, he's the one who puts Adam there and says, you till it, you keep it, you're in charge, right? So he puts a level of trust, a level of reliance onto humanity. That's not to say that God is somehow incapable of doing things on his own. No, right? So this is the problem, right? We think of reliance as some sort of weakness. It's not in any way a weakness. When he does this, God does this throughout the scripture. His primary way of working in the world is by using humans to accomplish his work. When we connect meaningfully, authentically with individuals around us, we are furthering the work of God because we're showing them a level of unconditional love and acceptance that they would have otherwise never been able to experience. Now, hopefully, you'll be able to bring that back into your faith and connect it to why it is that you go out of your way for this individual or that individual. And hopefully, you'll be able to make that connection. But nonetheless, this is continuing of God's work. Another fruit is that this allows us to have genuine freedom to be authentic. Um, there are struggles that I will go through as an Achin that I cannot share with my parish members. But I have a fellowship of Achins who I can be vulnerable with, who I can share my struggles and my challenges with, and I feel very safe and comfortable there, and I can be authentic there. Now, that's not to say that I'm not being authentic in other situations, right? Social maturity, emotional maturity does not mean that you act the same in all situations, right? That's actually immaturity. Social maturity means you know how to appropriately engage in different kinds of relationships. So like the kind of relationship that I have with my parish members, I don't think it's appropriate for me in certain situations to open up all of my burdens. One, they may not understand it. Two, it might be very counterproductive. But there is, by God's grace, a community of friends that I have where I can do that. So having friendships and social emotional connections with others helps us to let down the guard, to be vulnerable with one another. You don't have to hide your emotions or suppress your emotions. You can let them come out. And you see this vulnerability beautifully in the Psalms, in Psalms like, how long, O Lord, will you forsake me? How long will you forget me? Right? That's just raw vulnerability before God. He doesn't care if God thinks that he doesn't have faith or not. He's just being authentic. And so the freedom to be authentic is a fruit. It is a gift of social and emotional connectedness. And lastly, not that this is the only thing, but I think one of the great fruits of social emotional connectedness is you get to discover yourself. And so everyone has a literal and figurative blind spots. A blind spot, by definition, is something that you cannot see. When you are talking about figurative blind spots that you have, you need someone who is close enough to you to be able to say, hey, I don't think this is right, or I think this is a different perspective that you might not be catching on to. And so the benefit that we all can receive from social genuine connectedness is you can have a mirror shown up to yourself. Everyone has an image of what they think they look like. But what we think we look like isn't always what we look like to others. Now, I'm not saying that you should now base your image on what others think of you, right? That's not necessarily healthy either, especially if the others that you're talking about are people who don't care about you, people who don't accept you. But for those who do accept you, for those who do love you, they see something about you and they can share their critiques with you. And I think in that way, iron sharpens iron. One of the most fruitful relationships you'll ever have in this world is the relationship in a marriage, where you will be with one person for the rest of your life, God willing, and you will be able to discover yourself by accepting the other person. And it's a beautiful mystery in how that works. But this is one of the ways that reasons why we so desperately need to make sure that we're maintaining social and emotional connectedness in these days. It can be um, it can be a crutch. And I should say this real quick to give a counter perspective, right? Don't use community as a crutch to not work on yourself. Don't go out and be friends with everyone just so you don't have to work on your own issues, right? There needs to be that balance of working on yourself while interacting with others. But I think when we do that, when we do it the right way, in the right form, it can be a very blessed experience. So I think that my time has expired. Um, yeah. Any questions?